totally sure.
Skipped over that whole thing.
Just do whatever you want to do.
Dude, this is fun. I like
do whatever you want to do.
I like doing this with you.
Wrap it up.
Oh,
my day off. All right, welcome back to week number 10 of Community Group Curriculum. Chris, we went through the narrow gate that leads to life.
Yep.
Very few find it, and it's harder. And the wide gate that leads to destruction, and it's easier, and very many find it. And so really just stayed on that theme, because obviously it's massive and big for both, as we talked about, non-Christians, and we wanted to give a real kind of clear call to accept Christ. But also Christians, because of course he wrote it, as I talked about in chapter 5, verse 1, he's talking to disciples when he brings them up the mountain. So there's all these hard, difficult decisions that we have to make once we've entered the gate.
Sure.
There's stuff about being a man and a woman and money and sexuality and raising kids and all these difficult things. And oftentimes it's the harder road, but he says that narrow road leads to fullness, and so we unpack that idea, and hopefully that landed for people. Certainly in my own life, that's been the case. The harder road has equaled fullness spiritually, and so just be encouraged as you're sitting there. If you're going through difficulty, Jesus says your difficulty is going to end in a kind of fullness that you couldn't really even understand now. There's this great verse in Romans 8 where Paul says the glory to come is going to be so great that it makes the present suffering, it's incomparable to the present suffering that we have right now. This is all going to give way to something glorious, and so be encouraged, keep going.
Totally, and I think that's such a huge draw, and thing that you say, like it's not the easiest road, and obviously the one that's easy and the one that's nice and general, and then people want to be part of it. And in those moments when you're suffering, in those moments when you're feeling weak or you're feeling tempted or you've lost something, I mean, this literally overlays so many life circumstances, from the most horrible things to the subtle temptations you face every day. It's important to know that even in those moments, in big or little, that there's something better for you that God has for you in those moments where it's like, you know what, no, this is going to lead to life. You know, this hard decision I'm making, the one that I know is right, the one that in that moment, that's the one I need to take because it's what I'm being called to as a Christian, and it's the one that, like you said, even on a personal level, that's what leads to life and leads to fullness.
Are there moments in your life that you can look back on and go, you know, I made the tougher decision and it led to good things?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think even, I mean, in a broad sense, I mean, things like even working and leaving my job in Winnipeg, being like, wow, this is a decision that we had to make as a family and that we felt called to make. That's a kind of one of those big ones.
It was difficult to leave Winnipeg to come to Vancouver. That was really, that you really see
it was so hard.
As a costly...
Well, being there now, I mean, it's like, you know, we do love it out here. But obviously, leaving family and things like that on a serious note, that was very difficult. And still sometimes is where you feel the draw, like, do we go back? Is it something of my heart to head back there? You know, is it just in me? Is it where God actually wants us? What the case is? And to deal with those kind of things. But actually knowing, man, there's a destination involved too, and there's something that God's calling us to here.
It was similar for us. Like, I mean, we left family, and right now, we even, you know, we live in a situation where obviously family's all back in Toronto, and we're here, but we wouldn't have this beautiful church and see this movement of God that we're seeing and being a part of.
Absolutely.
Without that, and there's cost to it. We don't have people that, you know, take care of our kids and our family. Of course, that, you know, everyone says we'll take care of your kids and stuff. It's like, you know, but having the grandma there and whatever.
Sure.
And so there's this cost, but it leads to a kind of fullness that's really an eternal kind of thing that's beautiful. And so I'm sure you guys have a lot of examples of this in your own life. Jesus pulls out this principle, obviously, in regard to salvation, but it goes beyond that as well. And so why don't you guys talk about that right now? Times when you've had to make those difficult decisions, but that narrowness and those difficult decisions have actually led to a kind of fullness in your life.
That's right. And not even just little big ones, but also the little ones, you know, a fullness of like where you felt tempted, where you felt drawn into something you shouldn't be in, and where you've said, you know, sometimes in that moment it's good to remind yourself to be like, you know what, God has something better for me right now than what I'm feeling tempted by or what I'm feeling to be drawn into. So let's discuss. So, Mark, we talked about two different roads: a wide road that leads to destruction, a narrow road that leads to fullness to life, here and now, but also in eternity. One of the big things I want us to draw out and to remember in all of this is that all of it rests really on the destination. That so many important things in how we function, how we live, what we decide, what decisions we make in life, it all leads to one place or another. So there's two places here. But there was an author who came out a while ago who kind of posed the question, I mean, what if it wasn't just this narrow road that led to life, but other people get an option? They get another chance. The people on the wide road get a second chance at choosing Jesus. He didn't dispute that Jesus was the only way. He just said, like, what if there's another option for people post-death to make a decision for Christ and to be saved and brought into the kingdom of God? I mean, because my heart would be, and honestly, if I think about that, I would love to see more people know Jesus. I would love to know that family members who have died without knowing him aren't in hell for eternity and they have a second chance at maybe being redeemed. I mean, if I get to heaven,
same situation,
right?
Yeah.
And God ends up being a universalist, I'm not going to be heartbroken about that. Right. Like, can you unpack kind of what it looks like and why? Because I believe otherwise. I'm not saying I believe those things. Yeah. I believe otherwise, but what's the...
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this has been around the church, the desire for, God, a universalist, of course, is someone who just believes everybody goes to heaven in the end. And there's all kinds of different streams of that, even within Christianity throughout the many years, centuries and centuries of people who've discussed this. And it is seen as a heresy, and so you're fired. No, I mean, it's seen as a heresy because it falls outside of what I think Jesus is getting at, which is over and over in his teaching. Yes. So it is my heart, too, obviously, that, as many, and it's God's heart. That's the whole point, is God's whole heart is that as few would perish as possible. And it's interesting. Yesterday I was out with a woman and her boyfriend, and we were talking about she's 40 years old and doesn't believe in any of this. And it was between services, actually. Between the fourth and fifth service, I went out with them because she was a non-Christian who had all these questions. And she sat down and she said, we talked about the different worldviews and why she would choose Christianity. And I kind of pointed out to her that, because she was like, well, what about all the kids in Africa who've never heard and that kind of stuff? And I said, the beautiful thing about Christianity is we see in Jesus Christ a God who did everything in his power to woo us. He went to the greatest lengths to see as many saved as possible. He didn't remain up in heaven and hope that you would follow some rules in a book so that one day you could find him. He came down. He literally put his life on the line. He did everything he could to woo you. And so this is a God who is going to do everything in his power to save as many as possible. Yeah. And he's going to judge people based on his. We have to know that he's good. He's better than us. He's better than your heart, man. Like your heart, my heart is like, listen, Jesus just got through saying, if you ask, in life, if your child asks you for a fish, you don't give him a stone. Yeah. And then he says, God is better than you. He's a better father than you. And so he loves your family who died without him more than you do. And he loves my family who died without him more than you do. And he is fully good, a good father, as Jesus just got through saying. And he's fully just. And he's going to judge people based on his wise evaluation of their soul and their heart, which is sometimes darker than we would ever see, but is sometimes better than we would ever see as well. It's the privacy of it. And so he's good, and that's why we can sleep at night. Yeah. Because now, I don't think that means everyone goes to heaven. I think the Bible, from beginning to end, whether you're talking about Moses getting up in front of Israel at the end of Deuteronomy and saying, there's two roads. There's choose life. There's life and death. There's blessing and cursing. There's land or no land. You got to choose life. Choose life. Jesus picks up that same image and theme as a new Moses, saying, "Choose life," over and over. Whether you're in Paul or in Revelation, or I was reading when you were talking about this and thinking about John chapter 3 at the end of the whole Nicodemus conversation, and then John starts unpacking theology, and in John 3, verse 30, pick it up in verse 32 of John 3. Whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. And then this line, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. We can't forget that the wrath of God, there's a justice in it. And God in his wisdom will sort out who gets it and who doesn't. But we come behind the Son who took the wrath for us. And so our life needs to be spent telling people about that so that as few as possible actually suffer the wrath. But I think all the way through it, right to the end of the book of Revelation, you have this place called hell, called destruction. And unfortunately, the images are visceral, but they're these images, whether it's Revelation 14 you're reading or 21 and 22, it's this place where the torment of those who haven't believed in Jesus rises day and night without rest forever and ever. And they're there, and it's conscious, and it's forever. And because it's so awful, that has to drive us, that has to motivate us to actually tell people about him and move the mission forward. If that wasn't the case, the motive would be less. And so we have to hold on to these two things as much as your heart is at and my heart is at. There's a reason, and theologians throughout history have talked about, as hard as this is to understand even, that there's a reason this place of destruction exists. And because God's top priority in the universe, of course, is his own glory. When you read Revelation, the existence of this place actually plays a part in the universe toward the glory of God. It's this eternal preaching of his justice and his holiness and his righteousness and his salvation in Jesus and the awfulness that Jesus had to go through to accomplish our saving from this place. And so it has a place, as hard as it is for us to understand. And so really, I think it's there. It's supposed to motivate us toward mission, and hopefully it can do that as we sit and it's almost this really sobering thing that we would allow this reality to really cause us to discuss things, to discuss people in our life that really need to hear about Jesus, so they don't end up there.
So in 7 verse 12, it says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. I wanted to touch base on this because we didn't have a lot of time on Sunday to get into it, but I think it's an important part. And really it's saying like that the golden rule, as it would be said, is doing unto others, treating others however you would, as you would want to be treated yourself. I think this has a real significance in how we function with other people, but a lot of times we kind of because it's the golden rule and we've heard about it, and we're like, anybody inside the church, outside the church, this is something would say it's a good principle, right? Like, I don't think anybody would deny that this is a good principle of life to live by. But one thing I think we do is we don't apply it to all of the areas of our life like we should. So we don't put it into things like where it's like, man, I want to be fulfilled, and I know I want to be fulfilled, but I also then want to see your fulfillment. I want to see other people's fulfillment in the same fulfillment that I would want. And there's a few things that get in the way of that, whether that be jealousy, where I see somebody get something I want, and I'm just like, oh man, I wish I was able to do that, or I wish I could have that, or have that experience. But in the other side of things, also for social justice, things that we would want to help other people with, where it's like, man, I see somebody hurting, I see someone suffering. I know that I would want help in that situation, or I know that I wouldn't want to be in that situation. How can I empathize with them? How can I actually practically love them well? With this, though, when it ties in with the narrow gate, the wide gate, the destination of both heaven and hell, what is it then that would motivate us to do social justice now, as opposed to really caring for their spiritual condition later? Is there a significance between the two? Is there something where we should hold maybe, because this is what I see sometimes. I see people say, hey, we shouldn't help people unless there's a component of the gospel in it. There's a way of us verbally telling them, saying, hey, this is how, we're going to get into their lives. This is who Jesus is. This is, which is important. I'm not saying that it isn't. But is there a place for us to just be helping people as opposed to having them prepared?
Yeah, I think there's a biblical precedent all the way through the scriptures about helping the poor and the widows and the orphans and all these types of groups all the way through. And all the way through the New Testament, and it's kind of this biblical idea of, I think what you're saying here is right. Let's tie in the golden rule into the narrow gate discussion and recognize that by treating other people the way that you would want them to treat you as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, you're actually helping people get to one of those two destinations of life or destruction. I've heard it said that it's hard to hear the gospel over a grumbling stomach. And so I don't think you always have to lead with, hey, I'm going to preach the gospel to you and then I'm going to feed you. I think you feed and you love and you serve people because it's the godly, but you do it motivated not to just be a good person or to go to heaven when you die, or because this is kind of what animals do in the evolutionary there's all these questions about motive toward helping. There's lots of people who don't believe in God who do social justice and whatever. Certainly. So it's not about one or the other. It's about two realms that come together, and the question of motive. Why are you doing this? Why are you motivated to help humanity? And it always comes back to to God and to the glory of God and to the gospel, and the God who is rich became poor so that we might become rich. Right. It's always motivated by that. And I think if that's true, then of course you can do, this whole book is going to end Matthew 25, where Jesus says, if you didn't give a cup of cold water to someone who needed it, you weren't my sheep. So go be a goat in the place of destruction. If you didn't clothe the naked, he doesn't couple that with, and you have to also make sure that you hand them a tract. It's, and so yes, of course, we love and then we do it. We kind of do it out of this clear motivation where we never hesitate to talk about why we're loving and serving the people that we are. And so I think that's, but yeah, it's a beautiful principle. C.S. Lewis talks about the idea, and I talk about it often, about at every moment we're helping people get to one of those two destinations, where if we saw them, they're going to become something in eternity, Lewis says, where if we saw them right now, we would either be tempted to worship them because they're so glorified and beautiful, or we would be tempted to hide our face and run because they're going to be such a horror and a creature that we can't even look at them. We're all going to one of those two destinations. And what's important is that you're loving people toward the destination where they're going to meet Jesus, because you also don't want to make sure you feed them and have them clothed and care about their goodness for 40 years, and then they die and spend an eternity without goodness and fullness. So that would be a dumb trade. And so we got to make sure that we're working toward both those things. And so why don't we talk about that tension, how you've experienced that tension in life, and how we can prayerfully love people, treat them like we hope to be treated, but not in isolation. I love how this is coupled with the narrow gate discussion, because it's not just some verse you post somewhere. It's connected to getting people toward the destination of life versus destruction. Talk about that.